Hello, everyone. My name is Meredith.
And I'm John.
And welcome to our first episode of Movie Moms. Hello, everyone. Like I said, my name is Meredith, and this is Movie Moms, a podcast where we analyze famous or infamous mothers in the movies. I'm a PhD student studying cinematic rhetoric, which basically means I analyze how movies shape our collective beliefs about the world. So, John, you want to tell us a little about your connection to the movies?
Sure, I would love to. For as long as I can remember, I have been a cinephile. I grew up with a single mother who loved movies and movie history. She really helped shape my fascination with movies, their stories, and the stories behind them. I remember growing up, we would make a list and go down the list and cross off the movies as we saw them, which really helped to shape my view of the world in terms of how I related to other people. You know, other kids were watching kid shows, and I was watching my 10th Gregory Peck movie. So I think movies have always had such a special connection in my life. I think even our relationship and now our marriage has largely been influenced by the movies. I mean, the first time we ever hung out outside of work in college before we even had a romantic relationship was at the movies, you know, at Alma Drafthouse. And our first but unofficial date, well, was also at the movies at Alma Drafthouse. In fact, do you remember what we saw?
Yeah, we actually saw Stephen King's It back in 2017, and it was quite the time. But anyway, so with our combined backgrounds, which mine is a little bit more academic and John's more popular culture, our goal here is to talk about how representations of motherhood in movies make us think about motherhood in general as a society. We have a few segments on this show, the first being a little gateway into the academic world where I provide some background into motherhood studies. We'll then move into talking about our movie mom of the day. So, John, you want to share what our movie today is?
Yeah, today we're going to be talking about a great but maybe less seen film, Jason Reitman's 2018 film, Tully.
Yeah, I'm really excited about using Tully as our first movie here. It shows a really interesting depiction of 21st century motherhood. But before we get into it, let's dive into our background segment, Behind the Scenes. Since our movie mom of the day is a 21st century, pretty contemporary depiction of a mom, we have to talk about post-feminism. In the 1980s and 90s, there was a backlash to the radical feminist movement of the 70s. You know, the supposed bra-burning gay lesbians we've seen portrayed in the media. After this, we kind of collectively decided that feminism had been achieved, and that women were now equal with men. We could pretty much have it all: the job, the house, the kids. We really didn't need radical feminism anymore, hence the post of post-feminism. But that really isn't the whole story. Post-feminism ignores the reality of gender inequality we still see today. Women making less than men in the same roles, and like we'll be talking about today, the continued expectation to be a quote-unquote good mom. Our contemporary moment actually puts a lot of pressure on women to succeed in every realm of life. We have to be great at being a mom and be a great career woman. Post-feminism, as scholars like Bell Hooks have pointed out, presents this kind of illusion of choice. Sure, we now have the choice to have a career, but those societal expectations of being a good mom never really went away. Mothers are expected by society to be dependable, self-sufficient, and caring, basically to grind and make sure we are the perfect embodiments of self-care. Mothers are burdened to take care of themselves and their families perfectly. And these pressures are different for women of color too. Specifically, poor women of color have never been able to live up to these standards if they accept help from the government. They're seen as lazy and irresponsible for even having children, which of course completely ignores how the US is terrible about providing access to birth control or reproductive education. And as we'll talk about today, the movie Tully actually does depict a lot of the pressures put upon mothers by society. but does it change the overall narrative? Let's dive into it. Okay, so today we're talking about Tully, a movie that came out in 2018, directed by Jason Reitman, starring Charlize Theron. So warning, spoilers ahead, but Tully tells the story of a white, middle-class mother of two, Marlo, who unexpectedly gets pregnant with her third child. So while her husband remains absent-minded while she attempts to care for her three children, she's physically and emotionally exhausted. So her wealthy brother offers to actually buy her a night nanny, and she hesitantly agrees after the stress just continues to build here. So throughout the film, we watch as Marlo and this night nanny, Tully, bond, and Marlo basically comes back to life. So she's fulfilled and healthy now. So while Tully takes care of the children, she bakes cupcakes for the children's class and provides Marlo the company and sanity she craves. Marlo is reminded of her past freedoms through Tully and negotiates her identity as a mother. But eventually and shockingly, Tully is actually revealed to be a mere figment of Marlo's imagination, a version of Marlo's past self. So Marlo has basically been functioning on very little sleep to become this superhuman mother, and she's helped by her past self, which is a figment of her imagination. At the end of the film, we see Marlo and her husband jointly cleaning the kitchen, smiling, but only after she has recovered from a car accident induced by this sleep deprivation and postpartum psychosis. So popular commentary surrounding the film praised Tully for its quote-unquote realistic representation of motherhood as messy and challenging and pretty much overwhelming. And others have stated that it positively draws attention to the underrepresented phenomena of postpartum depression and psychosis. But let's see what we think. Okay, John, we rewatched Tully last night. What are some of your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I really like Tully. I think this is the fourth time where we have actually rewatched it, and obviously you picked it to be one of your papers for your program, which is great. But I think we first saw it in the movie theater, and obviously this is a movie with a pretty sizable twist at the end, with Tully actually being the younger version of Marlo, which I think really, really worked for me the first time I saw it. And on second rewatches, I have some more skepticism about how well it works, although I still think it's a great movie. I think it tackles a lot of themes, specifically about motherhood. Obviously, we're on the Movie Moms podcast right now. And then I also think it has a lot to do with class, mental illness, and this expectations of people in current day, specifically women, specifically mothers. I think it's quite interesting. This is the third collaboration between Jason Reitman and Diablo Cody, the first of being Juno in 2007, which is obviously was a phenomenon and won Diablo Cody a original screenplay Oscar at the Academy Awards. And a lot of people think of Tully as a spiritual sequel to Juno, but as I did some more research about it, like I said, this is a third collaboration. The second of the collaboration between Reitman and Cody was Young Adult, and I think if you remember that, Mare, we watched it a few months back when we were maybe thinking about moving to Minneapolis, but it's about a young woman in Minnesota who goes back to her hometown to try to win back over her high school sweetheart, her high school love interest, also starring Charlize Theron. So I think really they act as somewhat of a trilogy, and Diablo Cody also said something very similar. She said Juno is about being prematurely thrust into adulthood. Young Adult is about resisting adulthood, and Tully is ultimately about finding grace and acceptance in midlife as an adult. And I think a lot of those that idea really shines through in Tully. And if you look at those three films as a trilogy, you can really see what she's trying to convey. So I just think it's an interesting third collaboration between the two.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because obviously I think Juno also has a lot to say about motherhood in our society. And yeah, so what do you mean it doesn't work for you upon second rewatch with Tully being, past Marlo?
I just have a lot of questions about like the continuity of things that happen. I have a few unanswerable questions that I don't think we'll get the answer to, especially not in this podcast. Maybe that's a question for Diablo Cody yourself, but just in terms of how it works, oftentimes, you know, big twist movies, if you watch them a second time, you can kind of see the thread that's running through it. And I'm not sure if it exactly works. Like, you know, would her brother Craig, I mean, wouldn't he figure out at some point that he wasn't paying for this nanny? Wouldn't have more conversation been happening between the two families to be like, well, there actually is no night nanny? Wouldn't have somebody have noticed this, you know, beforehand and said something? But maybe not. You know, maybe that's something that she was just going through as a mother. People just aren't really paying attention to her. Her husband was blatantly ignoring her. The people at her kid's school weren't noticing. So I'm not sure. I think it still definitely works. I just don't know if it works nearly as well. But I think that's the common case with a lot of movies. Look at something like The Usual Suspects. I don't really like that movie nearly as much as I did the first time I saw it, because I already know the ending and the twist there. So that's really, I think, what I'm trying to say, is that I'm just not sure it works as well, or at least not for me, as it did the first time.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I do think you're onto something, though, with the commentary there being like moms are expected to do all of this work and nobody really notices that the work that they are putting in, at least at the beginning part of the movie, which I think is interesting because the film really does work, like I've said, to kind of highlight the hard parts of motherhood. But as we move on, I kind of wanted to bring in a quote from Catherine Kinnick, a communications scholar, and kind of get your thoughts of how Tully relates. So Kinnick says, norms for maternal behavior are prescribed in the media through the binaries of the quote-unquote good and quote-unquote bad mother. The good mother, the noble mother saint, makes her family her highest priority, continually sacrifices her own interests for the good of her family, and conforms to expected gender roles of femininity. The bad mother is depicted as self-centered, neglectful, preoccupied with career, or lacking in traditional femininity. So, John, do you think Tully kind of reinforces these ideas, this binary of good, bad mother, or not so much?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I'm obviously not a communication scholar like you.
But that's the point, right? Like, we want to hear what the people think.
For sure, the people outside of academia, right? Just us out here. So I think yes and no. The reinforces the idea of the quote you just mentioned. I think that yes, of course, like Marlo is being shown to be what a good mother is, and I guess the juxtaposition of Elise, who is the other mother in the film, who is married to Marlo's brother Craig, who is definitely of a different socioeconomic class, has more, accessibility to different things like a nanny, a night nanny, the nanny that's there who has, I think at one point she mentions she has a nanny who has like a master's in early childhood education.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because it really shows, I think, it exemplifies this good, bad mother dichotomy pretty well because Elise, as you mentioned, is rich. She does her Pilates 3 times a week. She's not really taking care of her own children. She's outsourcing that to somebody else. And when we see Marlo, she's really resisting that, right? Like, she feels like she needs to be taking care of her children. And we learn at the end, like, it really was her the whole time taking care of her kids because she didn't want to outsource it to somebody else. So I do think the film really does, like, kind of make fun of Elise for being, too selfish, like this quote said, self-centered, preoccupied with career and money. So it is making fun of kind of, I think, this quote-unquote bad mother, but at the same time, reinforcing Marlo
as a good mom. But yeah, I guess that's the way the film is kind of setting it up, but I don't think Elise is necessarily a bad mother. If anything, she has the resources and the opportunities presented to her that because obviously of monetary resources that Marlo might not have. So I don't really think she's a bad mother. I think it's just a different way of presenting
and I'm not even
motherhood.
saying, like, I'm not saying she's a bad mother in real life.
Right.
I'm saying the film is kind of reinforcing society's idea of what good and bad motherhood is. Like, it's making fun of Elise. We're supposed to laugh along as an audience with Elise's portrayal. And that plays off of our understanding that she's, like, you know, kind of ditzy and, like, unintelligent. Marlo has to, like, explain something to her at dinner, right? Like she's stupid. She's not stupid, though. But I think as an audience, we're kind of invited to laugh at this depiction of the dumb, selfish mom.
Yeah, sure. And at one point, I think she not makes fun of, but she talks about how Marlo's hands are so full with Jonah, her son, who has some, you know, social anxiety and maybe some, like, issues in terms of
learning disabilities,
and you know, is having a hard time coping at school. And I think that's really kind of interesting. And it goes, like I said, it goes a lot into class, which is kind of what I was talking about earlier with the beginning of the themes. Even the school that Jonah is presently at, her brother Craig and Elise are big donors at, and they helped him get into the school. And now they're kind of being pushed out because Jonah, you know, needs an aid and he needs more specialized attention. And Marlo's dealing with that, along with dealing with her new, you know, baby Mia. And you just don't see Elise having all those problems, right? And I think mainly because there is just a difference in a difference in socioeconomic, you know, status.
But again,
there.
I think they're portraying Craig as kind of this, sorry, but like jackass. Like he's supposed to see, you know, like he's supposed to be kind of like this douchey guy, you know, that we're on Team Marlo. Like the audience is definitely on Team Marlo.
That's the way Reitman sets it up for sure, and I think the script.
So it's kind of a critique of this exorbitant wealth, but at the same time, if you don't notice, I mean, Marlo is still living with her family in this huge house.
Yeah, New York.
Yeah, right. Like this huge, like it looks like 4-bedroom with a lawn. I mean, they are definitely middle or upper middle class.
Yeah, that sounds great. We're recording this in the closet of a 1-bedroom apartment.
Right. So I think that's part of it too, right? Is that it's on the surface this critique of wealth, but they still have a lot of money.
Yeah, we're talking about, you know, 2 white families here who definitely have a lot of money. And there are first world problems, but you know that's somewhat of what we're doing with motherhood in this country. So I think it's
like it's portraying this as super normal. Again, normal mothers have all these resources available to them. Maybe not a night nanny, which is again kind of that extra wealthy segment, but you know, you can afford breast pumps and to stay home from your job, right? Like she's clearly on maternal leave.
Yeah.
And that's not, you know, a privilege a lot of mothers in this country do have. So it's kind of depicting this as normal, right? Just this kind of lifestyle in general. But okay, before we get too far in the weeds with that one, I really also wanted to touch on a little bit about Marlo's negotiation with her sexuality, because I think that is unique to this film specifically, because you don't see a lot of moms in movies depicted as bisexual. At least I haven't seen that. And I do think it really speaks to how this film is trying to be quote unquote progressive, but
2018. So
but it really just kind of reinforces norms for women, like norms we just talked about, right? It kind of reinforces being so self-sacrificial and, you know, joy comes from your children and your children only. But so what stood out to you about the representation of, you know, her sexuality, her negotiating that throughout the movie, talking with Tully about it?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. The character of Vi, who I believe used to be like an old flame of Marlo at some point, you know, and they lived in, I think it's Brush.
Yeah, they definitely lived together at some point and were romantically involved.
I think she addresses her as like a roommate at one point, but there's obviously something more going on there. I think that's interesting because you can kind of. And I think at one point she mentions that she had like rode every horse on the carousel and then settled for her husband, who was a bench, not even on the carousel, you know, metaphorically speaking, of just like, you know, partners throughout her early life. So I think.
But that's a really good point, because when she delivers that line, it's not out of, she's not really even making a joke. She's talking about how exhausting it was to be exploring her sexuality in that way, kind of being promiscuous or whatever you want to call that. She says it with like a sigh of relief. Like, she's happy that you use the word settled, but like, she's not really saying she's settled.
Well, you don't think she's settled for her husband?
I think she doesn't think she's settled. I don't think that's how the movie portrays it. I think that she is kind of communicating to the audience that, like, oh yeah, it's good to, and as we're going to talk about, I think the end of the movie kind of reinforces that. I mean, I think her, quote unquote, settling or choosing her husband and then being really happy with that decision, even as she's kind of exploring her past, motherhood, again, is kind of this end-all be-all for women here. I mean, that's what it's portrayed as to me. Like, the husband, the house, the literal, like, 2.5 kids, that's what brings women joy. Not, actually going out and exploring your sexuality or bisexuality or whatever.
Yeah, her sexuality is explored in a number of ways in this movie. I think even her watching the television show Gigolos is quite funny, because, like, whether it's her just diving deep into reality TV or maybe having some more sexual thoughts behind watching that show. Between that and then, I guess, Tully asking her, if she needs to put on some headphones if her and her husband want to make a little bit of noise upstairs. And her response is like, well, no, we don't do that. We don't do that in maybe anymore at this point in time. And I get it. She just had a kid.
Well, but that brings it to a really interesting scene, right? When Tully kind of entices Marlo, because remember, Tully is past version of Marlo, to go up and, in the film, it's portrayed as them having a threesome. But at the end of the movie, we realize, it's just Marlo and her husband having sex. So what I found so fascinating is that she's channeling her bisexuality and her kind of just ideas from her past into pleasing her husband. Yeah. Again, it's reinforcing that, like, no matter what you did, this is the end goal. Pleasing your husband, raising your kids, you can rekindle the flame, Yeah. Like, it's weird, right? Like, she's literally using, her sexuality that she's experienced in the past to kind of still reinforce that, like, nope, the right choice is to choose your husband.
This is off topic, but, like, is Tully, like, Tyler Durden? Like, but, like, like Fight Club, like they're like the same person, but it's like she's not having conversations with anybody else, and like there's no threesome going on there. It's just like one thing, kind of. I didn't put two and two together, but it's kind of like a modern day Fight Club without the fighting and more more things involving motherhood.
Yeah, that's funny. Okay, so I really want to talk about the end of the movie here, as we've talked about before, because I think that that's where we really see a solidification of kind of these post-feminist ideas we've been dancing around the whole episode, that, Marlo needs to be a good mom, and she is a good mom when she, like, kind of is self-sacrificial and only focused on her kids. So at the end of the movie, even after Marlo's accident, really tragic car accident there, Tully says to her, quote, "You're convinced that you're this failure, but you actually made your biggest dream come true. The sameness you despise, that's your gift to them. Waking up every day and doing the same things for them over and over. You are boring. Your marriage is boring. Your house is boring, but that's fucking incredible. That's the big dream." So, John, what does this quote mean to you in the context of this film? And maybe even we could talk about the scene after with Marlo and her husband. But yeah, what does this mean? Because again, this isn't said with sarcasm. Tully is being super genuine to Marlo here when she says that, that's the big dream.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it kind of goes back to what Diablo Cody was saying about this being the conclusion to like her unintentional trilogy with Juno and Young Adult, and that Tully is really about finding grace and acceptance in your midlife, and this is kind of your life, and there's beauty in that, finding beauty in different things, and she says that Tully kind of saved her life by coming back into her life at this point in time. I think that's really interesting, but I really think that quote that Diablo Cody gives is pretty significant in terms of just acceptance and grace about where you are, where you stand, and that's okay. Third kid, here we go.
Yeah. And I think that it's really interesting. Acceptance of what, right? Like acceptance of normalcy. What is, so again, for me in my brain, it's what is normalcy in our understanding of motherhood. And this film, like, again, it's hyperbolic in the sense that it shows that when you push yourself and never sleep ever, you're going to wind up, with an accident. Like, it's gonna not be good. However, but the end of the film for me really stands out because it just ends with her and her husband, who has been doing literally nothing to help out with these kids.
Playing a lot of video
Yeah,
games.
playing a lot of video games. He's just like, yeah, now I'll just help you out with the dishes. Like, you're doing great. And it shows that, like, this was all kind of worth it. I mean, she would really do anything for her kids. She has the big dream. The big dream is, sacrificing it all and kind of, being the primary person to care for her children, not even her husband. It's not even really about equality. It's all this pressure is put on the woman here to do that. But he's like, yeah, I'll just help you out with the dishes
it really
this
kind of
one
glosses
time.
over like a lot of the things that happened at the end of the movie, like that took the fact that it took him a massive car accident in which he would drunkenly drove off a bridge for him to be like, you know what, I'll help you with the dishes. I'll stop playing Gears of War until 3 a.m. and I'll just help you out here, babe.
Well, and the ending is really kind of this happy ending. Like, yeah, like you said, they ignore her accident, her mental health issues, any of that, to be like, no, yeah, like, we're equal now. Post-feminism at its finest, right?
Like, he's apologizing. Like, he's apologizing to her for, like, I'm sorry that I made you do this, essentially, or like my lack of helping led to this. But, like, dude, she also kind of drove off of a bridge drunk, like, and then she gets to go home and just like wash dishes with her husband, which is like hilarious because, like, wouldn't she have a DUI or DWI after that?
Yeah, I really, you've been really hung up on that, and I really don't care about that at all.
Completely defies all.
It's a cycle. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there that's not really real. Obviously, you're not going to have a past version of yourself come visit you, but whatever.
I know.
That's besides the point. What I really think it's showing is that, like, yeah, well, you don't want to push yourself too far, but for women, like, this is still their primary purpose, to, like, be domestic. You can have a career, but, like, still be domestic, still give everything to your kids. Like, your husband may help you out now because, yay, equality, but, like, nah, don't push it too far, but we still expect you to literally be in the kitchen. Which I think is funny. Okay, let's take a short break and move into our last segment, Rhetorician's Corner, where we talk about how I think this movie works to influence the audience on a rhetorical level. So, John, as you know, but our listeners might not know, when communication scholars or rhetoricians, such as myself, analyze media, we obviously really want to look at what messages are being communicated, which I think we really got into here. But we also want to look at how the film is working. And that distinction may not be so clear, but we'll talk about it. So, before I go into my take, any ideas about how this movie is persuading audiences to feel about motherhood?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the quote we mentioned in the last segment about the sameness, but I think that it's really presenting it as hard. I don't know if you remember the trailer for this movie, but I think there was one specific moment in which there's like a baby crying, and Marlo, Charlize Theron's character, is like over the crib and the baby's crying, and she's like trying to like comfort it and console it, and but she's like scrolling through her phone and then drops the phone on the baby and then starts crying. So I think it's interesting. It's a bit of a commentary on motherhood during the time where we're constantly looking at screens. But I think overall it's really just talking about how damn hard it is. But
it's showing it as normal. Like, it's normal.
Right.
But that's what I mean. It's normalizing, I think, the hardness of motherhood in a really kind of funny, a little bit dark, comedic way.
Yeah. One thing I think is really interesting is how like cavalier the actual birth is. Like, they just like the water breaking, even the water breaking scene is like she just kind of wakes up in the middle of the night and is like, oh, my water broke, time to go to the hospital. And then they have the baby and they come home, and then the movie really kind of like starts, and then you get like two, I love a movie montage, but you get that movie montage where it's just the same thing happening over and over and over, like the diapers and like the little, what are those things called? The diaper machine. I don't know. Whatever
like
that
the
is.
diaper genie.
The diaper genie.
And the bottle warmers.
And
the
it's
pumping.
just like over and over and over. And it's like there's a montage.
And she looks
of, like,
exhausted.
And she looks so exhausted.
Until, of course, she has Tully, which is kind of brings her back to life.
Yeah, and then you get that.
But it's just herself. Like, she
herself.
reinvigorated herself. It literally, to me, it makes it feel like all moms have like this superhuman mom just like waiting to be awoken in them, and our job as moms is to unlock that.
Yeah, and then you get that second montage where it's much more happy. Things are like just going great, and
but she's really like sleep deprived to the max, which is crazy.
That's kind of what maybe goes to like the overall idea of like this film. Is like, is this like a good thing? Like what she's doing, because like obviously she's having some like mental health issues, but like are we glorifying the idea that like she's supposed to be doing all this stuff by herself, and the only way for like, because the second montage is all happiness, so much happiness,
right.
It's so much different. It's not like everybody else around her is happy, and like their life seems better for everybody. So like, what is that really saying?
Well, I think that leads me into what I wanted to bring in. So I really wanted to bring in an interesting concept from rhetorician Kristen Hoerl, which is called cinematic jujitsu, which is doing exactly, I think, what you're describing, but just giving some language to it. So I don't want to say it's tricking the audience, because I think that gives rhetoric a bad rep, and it already doesn't have a great rep. But I do think it's how this film in particular works to seem progressive, to like, portray, like we said, this realistic depiction, quote unquote, of motherhood. But it really just reinforces these problematic norms of motherhood and post-feminism that we see, right? Like, it is kind of like glorifying that, like, yeah, you really should, like we just said, work really hard and, unlock the superhuman mom within. But Hoerl developed the concept of cinematic jujitsu when she was analyzing the film Malcolm X. So she argues that the film Malcolm X works to kind of expose racism and the inequality problems with the American dream myth by celebrating the American dream myth itself in the movie. And I love this theory here, but she makes a really compelling case because the film was structured in a way that walks Malcolm X through the American dream hero structure. Like, it walks him through the American dream. However, it conflicts with the message of Malcolm X, which is, against kind of systemic injustice. But it makes it more convincing to audiences. That's how it functions rhetorically, is like below the surface, we're kind of subtly being persuaded because, Malcolm X is following this American dream, but we're more likely to, interpret the message and kind of be convinced by the message of Malcolm X because, the movie used that structure. And so I think Tully kind of works in a little bit of a reverse manner. So by showcasing how hard motherhood is, even by making fun of rich people's parenting choices, as we talked about, it subtly reinforces through its ending how worth it this really taxing form of motherhood is that Marlowe portrays. So when we specifically see and identify with this quote-unquote real motherhood portrayed in Tully, we can be persuaded that, like, yeah, we really should try to balance it all and really sacrifice for our family. Don't push it too far, like I said, but finding the right balancing act that post-feminism really highlights.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I've obviously heard you talk about cinematic jiu-jitsu a bit before, but of course some of these concepts are a little bit over my head, not being in academia. So do you think this was intentional, like in particular on the part of like Reitman and Diablo Cody?
I think that's a really fascinating question that rhetoricians definitely debate. I mean, I have come to a consensus in myself, but that when we're talking about rhetoric and the, possible persuasiveness of a text like a film, we really don't think that intention matters very much, because how it subtly persuades an audience, I mean, that's out of the hands of the directors and writers and producers. Like, I mean, a lot of the time, those people don't even know what their own intentions really are. But more so, we're just looking to see about how the audience interacts with the text itself. Like, what messages are they taking from it? How is the film working to, you know, persuade us about motherhood as kind of this structural, you know, force in society, as this kind of institutionalized thing instead of just, you know, mothering as being a mom. But yeah, does that help clarify a bit?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting, and you and I have often talked about intention versus impact in terms of filmmakers, you know, maybe.
Yeah, it's definitely impact versus intention, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're looking at how the audience is invited to respond, is basically what I like to say all the time.
I guess before we go, did you like this movie? I know you've seen it a lot of times for writing your paper. So does it still work for you? Do you still like it? Would you recommend it to people?
Yeah, I mean, there is a reason I picked it for our first Movie Moms episode, is I really like this movie. I really like Charlize Theron. I really like the performances from the rest of the cast. I think it's fascinating. I think the twist, for me, works really well. Of course, if you listen to this whole thing, that has been ruined for you, but I still recommend that you check it out, because I do think it's saying a lot about what moms are expected to do in our society today.
I gotta ask one more question. And does this movie persuade, dissuade, have any effect on you wanting to become a mom? And just, you know, I'm not talking as your husband here. I'm just talking in general.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and maybe one we can incorporate into all of our episodes. But yes, so I am not a mom currently, but, you know, I think that's how...
Well, you're a cat mom.
I am a cat mom, but I think that's how persuasive this movie really is. Like, the first time I watched that scene with the last line of, you know, like, the sameness is great, like, the sameness is the big dream, like, I did get that kind of, like, visceral, warm feeling in my chest of being like, yeah, like, this is really great. Like, I do want to do this, which I think is, again, the power of cinematic rhetoric, right? So no, I don't think it dissuaded me. I do think I myself am a little bit more critical of, you know, the structures of sexism and, you know, whatever that are prevailing in our society today. So I'll definitely resist that, I think, in my parenting as much as I can, right?
Got it. Well, I can at least promise you one thing. I'll be a much better dad than Ron Livingston's character.
Yeah,
no late night video games for me.
Yeah, wow. All right. Well, everyone, I'd like to thank you for listening to our first episode of Movie Moms. We hope that this podcast is fun, but that you also learn a little something about how films work to persuade us. Bye, everybody.
See you later.